In Renaissance Italy, artists changed the world with paint, marble, and genius. But behind that beauty stood something else: money. And no family understood that better than the Medici. They began as bankers in Florence. But over time, they became kingmakers, patrons of genius, and one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. This is the story of the Medici family, the bank that helped create the Renaissance. Florence, in the 15th century, was not the largest city in Europe. It did not command vast armies. It did not rule a sprawling empire. And yet, it changed the world. This was the birthplace of the Renaissance, a period when Europe seemed to wake up from centuries of stagnation. Art returned with intensity. Architecture became ambitious again. Philosophy rediscovered human potential. Florence became a magnet for brilliance. Painters, sculptors, architects, and thinkers all converged here, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But history often focuses on the visible, the masterpieces, the cathedrals, the names of great artists. What it forgets is what made all of that possible. Because beauty on that scale is not just inspiration. It is infrastructure. It is organization. It is money. And in Florence, one family understood that better than anyone else. When people think about the Renaissance, they imagine Michelangelo carving marble, Leonardo da Vinci sketching ideas far ahead of his time, or Brunelleschi designing the Great Dome of Florence. But none of these projects existed in isolation. Every sculpture required stone, tools, and years of labor. Every painting required materials, space, and time. Every architectural project required massive funding, coordination, and long-term commitment. Someone had to pay for it. Someone had to believe in it. Someone had to make it possible. And in Florence, that someone was often the same name: the Medici. They were not artists. They were not generals. They were not kings. They were bankers. And that gave them something far more powerful than a title: influence over what could exist. The Medici family did not begin as rulers. They did not inherit a kingdom. They did not arrive with armies or noble titles stretching back centuries. Their rise began in trade and finance, in the practical world of money, exchange, and opportunity. Florence, at the time, was a republic. It was filled with competing families, merchants, and political factions. Power was fluid. Influence could be gained and lost. In that environment, the Medici learned something essential. Stability and influence could be built not through force, but through finance. Because every merchant needed credit. Every noble needed liquidity. Every institution needed funds. And whoever could provide those services became necessary. By the early 15th century, the Medici had established something that would change their trajectory forever: the Medici Bank. This was not just a local operation. It was structured, organized, and designed for scale. Branches appeared in key commercial cities: Rome, Venice, Milan, and beyond. This allowed the Medici to move money across regions, facilitate trade, and manage accounts for powerful clients. But what truly set them apart was not just their wealth. It was their system. They developed networks of correspondence, trust, and coordination. They kept detailed records. They maintained relationships across multiple centers of power. They understood risk. In other words, they were not just accumulating wealth. They were building an institution. One of the most important breakthroughs in the Medici rise came from a relationship that would define their power: their connection to the church. In Renaissance Europe, the Catholic Church was not just a religious institution. It was a political and financial powerhouse. It collected revenues across multiple regions. It funded projects, maintained influence, and required constant financial management. The Medici positioned themselves as the bankers of the papacy. And that changed everything. Because managing the finances of the church meant access to information, access to power, access to influence across Europe. It meant that the Medici were no longer just serving merchants. They were serving one of the most powerful institutions in the world. And in doing so, they moved into an entirely different league. If the Medici Bank created the foundation, Cosimo de' Medici built the empire. Cosimo was not a king. He held no official title that matched his influence. But in Florence, he became something far more effective. The man who understood how power actually worked. He controlled wealth. He controlled relationships. And most importantly, he controlled perception. Cosimo did not rule openly. He avoided unnecessary attention. He presented himself as a citizen among citizens. Modest, careful, restrained. But behind that image, he guided decisions, influenced appointments, and shaped the direction of Florence itself. He understood a principle that would define the Medici approach. Visible power attracts resistance. Invisible power endures. Florence was a republic. In theory, no single family ruled it. Power was distributed through councils, officials, and political processes. But systems like that often depend on influence behind the scenes. And Cosimo mastered that influence. He extended loans. He built alliances. He supported allies and quietly sidelined rivals. Over time, a pattern emerged. Decisions that mattered tended to align with Medici interests. Not because of force, but because of dependence. Because when financial stability flows through one family, that family becomes indispensable. And in Florence, the Medici became exactly that. But the Medici influence was not limited to politics. It extended into culture, into art, into the very identity of the Renaissance itself. They funded painters. They supported sculptors. They invested in architecture. They created an environment where creativity could thrive. This was not accidental. It was strategic. Because patronage did more than produce beauty. It produced legacy. It shaped how a city was remembered. It turned Florence into something extraordinary. And it tied that transformation to one name: Medici. But influence of that scale never goes unchallenged. Florence was filled with ambitious families, rivals who watched the Medici rise and resented it. Tensions grew. Alliances shifted. And eventually, those tensions reached a breaking point. Cosimo himself was exiled from Florence, removed from the city he had helped shape. For a moment, it seemed the Medici story might end. But power built on systems does not disappear easily. Cosimo's exile did not last, because even in his absence, Florence felt the gap he left behind. Financial stability weakened. Political balance shifted. The system he had built began to falter. And so, he was invited back. Not as a conqueror, but as a necessity. When Cosimo returned, his position was stronger than before. Because now, it was clear. The Medici were not just influential. They were essential. If Cosimo built the system, Lorenzo de' Medici perfected its image. Lorenzo was not just a banker or political figure. He was a symbol of Renaissance Florence itself. Under his influence, the city reached a cultural peak. Artists flourished. Thinkers gathered. The Medici court became a center of intellectual and artistic life. Lorenzo understood something crucial. Power is strongest when it feels natural. When it blends into culture. When it becomes part of identity. And under him, the Medici were no longer just powerful. They were admired. At their peak, the Medici influence extended far beyond Florence. They had connections across Europe. Influence within the church. In fact, members of the Medici family would go on to become popes. This was no longer just a banking dynasty. It was a network of power, spanning politics, religion, and culture. They had achieved something rare. Not just wealth, but integration into the structures that define history. But no system is permanent. And even the Medici were not immune to change. Economic pressures grew. Political tensions returned. External forces reshaped Italy and Europe. The very complexity that made the Medici powerful also made them vulnerable, because maintaining influence across multiple domains requires constant adaptation. And over time, that became harder. The Medici eventually declined as a dominant political force. But their impact did not disappear, because they had helped shape something larger than themselves. The Renaissance. The art they funded still exists. The architecture they supported still defines cities. The cultural transformation they enabled still shapes how we see the world today. Their power may have faded, but their influence did not. So what made the Medici powerful? It was not a single moment. It was not a single decision. It was a system. They understood that money, when organized effectively, becomes more than wealth. It becomes influence. They understood that funding ideas can shape culture, that supporting institutions can shape politics, that building networks can shape history. The Medici did not simply accumulate money. They deployed it strategically, patiently, and at scale. And in doing so, they helped create one of the most transformative periods in human history. Not as kings, but as something more subtle. The financiers of a new world.